peoples and is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We acknowledge these two territories because that is where we are located, but with the understanding that this is a national project with partners and presenters from across so-called Canada. We also acknowledge that we may have viewers from across the country and in other countries. So we encourage you to check out the link on this slide here, Native Land Digital, where you can find, based on your location, the land that you're on, whose land you're on, and learn a bit more about that land and reflect on your place and impact on the space and how you can support Indigenous people in your area.
Hi, my name is Sameer. So these are basic accessibility guidelines. So interpretation for this webinar is available in French, ASL, LSQ. To access them, please click on interpretation buttons and choose your option. To access translated captions, please click the up arrow next to the caption button and click the language. If you're unable to access them, please click on the more button. The link to download the accessible version of this presentation is available in the bottom right section titled Resources. If you have any questions during the session, please submit them in the Q&A section and they will be answered at the end of the session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amir. My name is Evan Wickland. I'm a senior research officer at Manitoba Head Lead Office in Manitoba. Olivia already introduced herself, but I just thought it would be a good idea to jump on and just introduce who will be speaking today. So we have Dr. Susan Hardy, the executive director, Dr. Cameron Crawford, having some technical issues on that end, but Cameron will be joining us as well. And then we have Dr. Peter Norman Levesque as well, and we'll all be taking turns speaking today to talk a little bit about our project. So we'll just be moving on. And it's just pictures of us. There's all five of us on the screen. Okay, so just a little bit about Eviance, just to provide some context for our informational webinar today. So Eviance was formerly known, and maybe some of you know us as the Canadian Centre for Disability Studies, which was founded in 1995 under the leadership of Henry Enns. So it goes back quite a ways, and the roots here are in Manitoba. Henry Enns was a celebrated trailblazer in the disability rights movement and the independent living movement in Canada. And so for over 26 years, we have been helping Canadians with disabilities and their allies advance human rights through intersectional community-based research that is co-created with diverse disability communities and is committed to sustainable solutions rooted in action. And for more information about Eviance in general, we have a website. And to hear more about this specific project as well, it'll all be on that website. So I encourage you to take the time and if you're curious to learn more about the project. Okay, just one more slide around our mission, vision, and impact. So as I said, we do community-based research, education, and development. But our mission is a hub of knowledge on local, national, and global cross-disability issues. We seek to realize behavioral and system-level change. Our vision is to create an inclusive, equitable, and accessible society that's sustainable for all. And our impact focuses on intersectional
I switched from my phone to the I switched from
sorry. Okay, maybe I'll just continue. I heard it's okay. We enhance intersectional action-based solutions that advance human rights and equity-focused decision-making. Okay, so just a bit about the agenda. Oops, my camera's having some technical issues here. Okay, everyone can hear me okay? Okay. So a little bit of an agenda today. We'll be, welcoming everyone. That's what we're doing right now, and providing a project overview. Then Olivia and I will talk about a literature review summary and just, again, providing context about what we're doing here today. Then we'll have a brief discussion and question segment, I suppose. And then we'll go and just have a short break a 10-minute break just to make sure that everyone's on the same page and that all the technical issues have been solved. And then we'll ask Cam to talk about the data analysis that we've done. And then Peter will talk about the 4 types of innovation and how that's applicable to this overall project. And then again, we'll have questions and discussion around Cam and Peter's presentations. And then there'll be a short evaluation that Amin will jump back on and talk a little bit about. There's a short survey at the end. Okay. So we're just going to jump right into the first presentation, which is called Inclusive Practices in Post-Secondary Education and Meaningful Employment for People with Disabilities. And this portion is called Exploring the Transition Between Inclusive Post-Secondary Education and Work. And Olivia and I will be taking this portion on. And so again, as Olivia alluded to, this is a recent project and it's ongoing. It's called the Sustainable Development Goals Literature Review. And that focuses really on the transition between post-secondary and decent work for students. Okay, I'd like to provide just a brief overview of this overall project, and this will sort of contextualize both Cam and Peter's content as well. So in 2022, we began work with multiple partners, St. Francis Xavier, Toronto Metropolitan, and OCAD University as academic partners, and the National Educational Association for Disabled Students, or NEEDS, the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, CCD, and Arch Disability Law Center. And this multi-year project is funded by the Government of Canada's Sustainable Development Goals Program. And thank you so much for this particular, to our contributors to this literature review. Dr. Tammy Bernowski, Mylika Jagal, and Sibel Sack also made invaluable contributions to this project. Oops, I didn't do that. To quickly summarize, the objectives of this overall project include supporting Canada's efforts to meet the Social Development Goals number 4, which is quality education. And I'll use the acronym SDG from now on, if that's okay. As a pathway to decent work, which is SDG number 8, by addressing gaps in knowledge and skills of key stakeholders and bringing many people together to create innovative solutions to issues surrounding post-secondary education. So this literature review is just one component of the entire project. So it informs further project activities for the broader project, including social labs, including this informational webinar, which will bring multiple stakeholders together to discuss the SDG goals. But we've also done an online survey to better understand the experiences of students with disabilities. And we've also taken various research projects on, including those of our partners as well that are listed on this slide. So we've done an analysis of town hall meetings from NEEDS, a lit review of another literature review and environmental scan on universal design, as well as, so we're only speaking about the literature review in this tiny section and the data analysis, but just know it's quite a bit bigger. It's an extensive project that's spanned over several years. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the themes and demographics, or just initial insights into what we did in the literature review. First, our review was grounded in the methodology of intersectionality and human rights, and we looked at 224 articles overall, 122 which had to do with post-secondary education, 27 which had to do with employment, and 75 had to do with the transition between the two. And we really tried to find as much in that third area as we could. That was sort of the overall goal of the lit review. Overall, we found that in general, more students with disabilities were entering post-secondary than ever before in Canada. So Ontario universities found an increase of 320% of students with disabilities from 1992 to 2008. However, we also found that in general, there was both a lack of intersectional analyses used by the authors, and the perspectives with people with lived experiences or with disabilities, both students and workers, employees, were underrepresented greatly. Continuing on with this point, this could be for a number of reasons, but we did find that very few authors conceptualize disability through any sort of human rights approach, and used medical model terminology when describing the experiences of students. And that disability as an identity was often used by disabilities in a very broad way, sort of a way that sort of categorized disability in a very broad way. So now we'll touch on these three core areas, and I'll ask Olivia to speak for the next section in our findings.
Thank you so much, Evan. So for this section, I'll start with some challenges to inclusive post-secondary education. So one of the barriers that we found is that there are significant barriers to actually completing post-secondary education. And there's obviously many different types of barriers there. So there's social, attitudinal, environmental, and technical barriers. So while more students with disabilities are accessing PSE, because of the barriers, there are fewer students completing post-secondary education. We also found significant issues with accommodations. So this includes accommodations within the classroom, like note takers or recordings, but also goes beyond the classroom to things like co-op placements, field placements, labs, and work placements. So this requires a lot of additional labor for students with disabilities in order to just get accommodations. We also found that there was issues with seeking support. So students with disabilities may be reluctant to seek support for a number of reasons. So they may be overwhelmed by the process. They may be worried about perceptions, especially from faculty and staff, and even other students. And they may want to do it on their own and don't want to rely on accommodations. And this is often due to certain misconceptions about accommodations. And this can come from students with or without disabilities, from faculty, and from staff. So this is usually the idea that students with accommodations are getting preferential treatment or are somehow being put at an advantage. We also noted student debt as a significant issue for students with disabilities. So the medical model leads to barriers in funding as well as a lot of gatekeeping. And there are specific debt issues for students with disabilities. So for example, part-time students with disabilities may struggle with finances, especially due to longer time spent in their degree, as well as exclusion from bursaries and scholarships. And finally, we did look a little bit at violence for students with disabilities, and we found that it's incredibly underrepresented in the literature. Students with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by trauma and violence in post-secondary education, and research is currently limited on this impact. So now I will move on to some kind of promising things that we found for the future of inclusive post-secondary education. So while COVID itself was not positive, the shift to online learning showed a lot of promise for change. And although there are obviously still quite a few barriers to this model, it did show a lot of possibility for online learning. We also found that student advocacy was a really positive thing. So student advocacy can create a sense of purpose as well as provide opportunities for relationship and skill building for students with disabilities and other stakeholders. We also found that the attempts at universal design for learning can create more inclusive and accessible learning spaces. However, implementation can be quite difficult due to the isolated nature of offices in post-secondary education. We also found that it was really important to create an inclusive culture where disability is welcome and important, and found that streamlined accommodations and funding processes would help students in qualifying for financial and institutional support. We also argue that training is needed for faculty and staff about disabilities and accommodations, as well as broader diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And finally, more collaboration is needed between faculty, staff, and students so that there's a better understanding of what it means to create an accessible and inclusive learning environment. And I will hand it back over to Evan to talk a bit about decent work. Evan, you're just on mute.
Thanks, Olivia. Just as Olivia mentioned, we'll be talking about meaningful employment, beginning with some of the challenges and then move to some of the more positive experiences in this section. Okay, so first we begin with areas for improvement. So in general, many graduates with disabilities, once they got out into the working world, feel that they do not receive adequate supports while attending post-secondary to prepare them for work upon graduation, and even anticipate that they may not be competitive in the job market because of this. In the workplace, we found that there were limited accommodations as well. So most people with disabilities believe that relatively simple accommodations could go a long way in making the workplace more accessible. Yet many don't receive them. And as a result, employees rather, feel they had fewer opportunities for some pretty significant landmarks or achieving those landmarks, things like advancing in their roles, professional training, or obtaining long-term employment. So that is just in the realm of precarious employment or a temporary status in those positions. We also found issues with disclosure. So many people with disabilities did not feel comfortable asking for accommodations from their employers. And so given this infrastructural and attitudinal, all these barriers, right? This unfortunately came to us as a little surprise given on what we researched in post-secondary. We found that many workers with disabilities anticipate the stigmatization that would potentially come along with asking for accommodations. We also found literature on job retention and precarious employment. So this is especially problematic for workers with disabilities because they might have opportunities to make stable connections with their peers, natural supports, or their employers. So several authors in our research argue that these employment disparities include job retention or lead up to job retention, less hours of work, lower wage, and access to benefits. So these include lack of equitable and inclusive recruitment as well, and hiring strategies and ableist assumptions by employees and coworkers, indicating a culture of ableism, which is, of course, problematic, throughout the span of someone's post-secondary to employment. So broadly speaking, this is a systematic culture of ableism. We also have strategies for inclusion. So there are many indicators for success. One is employment during post-secondary education. So one of the primary indicators for students who graduate to obtaining successful employment is working during their time in post-secondary education. So students with disabilities that work are twice as likely to find employment after graduation, which increases even more if they work during the last year of school or last couple of years of school, that last stint. So there are many reasons for this, but including providing students with the time and space to develop positive self-images or develop a identity that has to do with advocating for oneself, explore a myriad of options, right, in the employment world, and build relationships with coworkers and employers. Individualistic and holistic practices is the next strategy for inclusion. So this is another indicator for success. Career supports and services that people with disabilities receive should be ongoing and sustainable, individualized to the needs of each person, and address several aspects of someone's life. So it's not just about work itself. This may include, career services, but also access to things like public transportation, transportation to and from work, help with obtaining assistive technologies if required, and even mental health supports. The last one I'll talk about is collaboration with employers. So as we saw, as Olivia stated around post-secondary education, collaboration is really key here. So several authors pointed out that it's important for employers to be willing to collaborate with their employees with disabilities and implement policies which are inclusive and disability positive, where people are welcomed and acknowledged for the skills and knowledge they bring to the workplace. So having a disability positive component it goes a long way. People are expected to show up at these jobs, right? So it's not just about accommodations; it's about valuing people's contributions. I will throw it over back to Olivia for the next section.
Hello, and I do also just want to say, for anyone that missed it, the Q&A is open and we will have a Q&A section right after this presentation. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section and we'll get to them in about 5 to 10 minutes. So for transition from school to work, I will start first with the challenges that we found in transition. So things that have been noted for obviously a very long time were systemic issues that have persisted for decades. So this includes issues due to lack of access to transportation, lack of affordable and accessible housing, food insecurity, and discrimination were all noted as persistent and systemic issues that impact transition from school to work. We also found that income caps can be really difficult and force workers into precarious work. And income caps on support also result in less agency for workers and fewer employment opportunities. We also noted a big focus on the deficit or medical model. So a lot of the literature focused on students and workers with intellectual and or developmental disabilities, as this group tends to have worse employment outcomes. But there is still a lot of stigmatizing language used in this research and a exclusive focus basically on deficit and disorder. We also found that there was a real lack of wraparound services. And again, this is especially true for students with intellectual and or developmental disabilities, as services tend to end after high school. And post-secondary education tends to require a lot more self-advocacy than people may be used to. Further, employers cannot or will not accommodate workers to the same level, and this gap is often filled by expensive private transition programs. As noted earlier as well by Evan, there was a real lack of intersectional programming. So programming tended to be predicated on white middle-class values. So for instance, really focusing on people moving out of their family home. This is not necessarily the case for everyone. And very little research in this area considers the diverse experiences of people with disabilities. And finally, we noticed obviously a big issue with resources and funding. So there's a lack of assistive technology and funding for transition, little commitment from employers with regards to accommodations. So we feel that funds need to be allocated appropriately. And now I will move on to, again, some of the promising things that we found in the transition from school to work. So mentorship programs or elements of programs really help students with navigating transition and especially really helps with networking. And as mentioned in all of the other sections, collaboration is incredibly important, especially among service providers and people with disabilities. We also found that inclusive design in programming was really promising. So this means that it's open to all students interested in learning more about transition from school to work, whether they have a disability or not. And this is great because everyone can utilize it, but it also means that students with disabilities don't have to disclose in order to get support. We also noted that more paid work opportunities, especially early in life, have been shown to be a big benefit to graduates looking for future work. And community support from family and friends, as well as high expectations of success, have been shown to lead to more successful transition. So we have to make sure that people with disabilities and their support systems are empowered. And finally, employers need to be committed to changing policy and practice to ensure that people with disabilities have support and access. And I will hand it over to Evan one more time. You're just on mute, Evan.
Thank you. Thanks, Olivia. I'll just run through a couple of these fairly quickly. I'm just cognizant of time and that we're at already half an hour. So we'll just talk a little bit about our changes to research and what we recommend. Some more research utilizing social model, human rights models, intersectional models as well, understanding the diverse experiences of students, which seem to be lacking in the research. More disabled voices and lived experience in research, again, that was lacking. It was there, but not in abundance. Inclusive case studies for sure around, what grassroots organizations and advocacy organizations, community-based organizations have done in the past. I think there could be, we think collectively that there could be more research in that area. And then change to policy, so removal of income on benefits and support, more accessible and collaborative transition services or post-secondary options, and changes to policy that rely on just on diagnoses to receive support or benefits. So we want to recommend eliminating that portion, that qualification. Okay. So thank you so much for listening. Again, there's more information on our website. We really appreciate your feedback. And if there's any comments or questions, it would be wonderful to hear from you and continue this conversation, to have an ongoing dialogue. And just know that when you're responding, of course, there's anonymity can be a little bit of an issue, because just know that your name will be attached to the comments. We won't be using this for research, but just know that it's that is a thing. So I guess we should maybe take a little bit of a pause and just see if there's any questions.
So we have one question in the Q&A section so far. It says, do you have any recommendations for how to recruit / open pathways for connecting with and hiring students with disabilities? And they said, thanks for this amazing work. Thank you for your question. I think I would say recruitment, I think, would be pretty similar. I think showing that you have an accessible and accepting workplace is a really great way to make people with disabilities feel like your organization is doing the actual work, rather than just kind of paying lip service or attempting to hire people with disabilities without having the supports in place to make sure that they're accommodated. So yeah, I would say be honest and upfront about what kind of accommodations you can offer. And for recruitment, I would say, yeah, reach out to your networks or our networks if you ever want to get in touch with us about that kind of thing. Evan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, maybe just a brief comment, and I'll just invite maybe Cam or anyone else that has any sort of thoughts on this to speak as well. If there's anything that's looming or that they want to say, that would be much welcome. It'd be very welcome. I can say that there are, of course, transitional services that do really great work across Canada, for sure, right? But what we found, and Olivia, I think I'm safe in saying this, that there's a lack of evaluative research about those programs. So what are the success rates, and have researchers evaluated how effective those programs are? I'm sure it's out there, but we didn't find a lot of that in our environmental scanner lit review. It was a lot of, to be honest, like psychological literature on how to fix the issue of accessibility or something, right? So there's lots of work to be done there.
Cam, did you have something you want to add?
Yeah, I could chime in a little bit just in terms of the relationship between organizations that are in the business of supporting folks to get jobs. I think it's really important for those organizations to know who their employers are that they're working with, and what do those employers need, not in vague generalities, but very specifically, like what's the skill set, what kinds of interests, what kinds of experience, and so on. And then they also need to know in some detail who the people are who they're trying to support getting a decent job. And a really useful role they can play is in bringing about a match between what it is that the employer needs, not in vague and general terms, but in very specific terms, so that the people who get brought forward for the employer to select, and ideally the organization would be able to suggest several people, all of those people would be really good candidates. And then to build on those successes, like to garner employer support and interest, and don't disappoint, and keep feeding those needs of employers. That'll make the organization gain credibility and will help individuals with disabilities have more confidence in what the organization does, and will certainly give confidence to the employers as well. And another message, I think, for those organizations to give to employers is that if you're here, if you need us, we'll be here. Typically, employers don't need a whole lot of follow-up support, but they do appreciate knowing that if they do require it, it'll be there for them. And then again, you don't want to disappoint if you get a call. You want to be able to respectfully work through whatever issues need to be dealt with. That's just, I mean, there's many issues to look at here, but yeah, and you've hit on a lot of them, but that's just one.
Thanks so much, Cam. I'm going to try and really quickly answer these next two questions because I think I maybe have the most info, but if anyone wants to jump in, please do. So the first one is, what types of transition services do you think are most needed in PSE settings? So I'll quickly just touch on what we noted earlier. We're looking at inclusive programs where people with disabilities are not segregated. That's a really big one. And we also noted that inclusive programming can also mean that it's open to people without disabilities, because there's obviously going to be a number of people that are going to struggle with transition with or without disabilities. And again, it also means that students with disabilities don't have to constantly be disclosing their disability in order to get support for transition services. And ideally, these would be free services or services at a low cost, so that everyone can access. And then the next question was, you talked about gatekeeping in terms of financial supports and lack of scholarships and bursaries. Can you expand on this a bit more? So in reference to scholarships and bursaries, we were talking about part-time students with disabilities, as part-time students are often left out of scholarship and bursary opportunities. As for the gatekeeping, financial support is often really difficult to access for anyone. And there's a lot of hoops that you often have to jump through, a lot of medical documentation that you need, and a lot of internet skills and stuff like that that make it really hard for some people to access financial support. And we have quite a few other questions now. Maybe we can come back to them. I don't know if it's time for a break.
I think so, Olivia. I just wanted to add, like, I think that we can probably answer those questions. If it's okay with everyone, we'll maybe type the answers a little bit later, or we will address them for sure. But I think for time, maybe we move on for a break. I was just going to add, Olivia, to your first response. What type of transition services do you think are the most needed? And I think this is something that Cam has said early on in the project that really stuck with me, that I've sort of carried on in doing this project work. The idea that so you can get inside the door of the university or the college or the place of work. So you can, right? So say physical access is one thing, but what is keeping you there? Like, like, it's not just physical access of being able to get inside the building. It's what happens then, right? And finances and stigmatization, or lack of technological supports, ableist attitudes, all of these things address the holistic needs of students with disabilities. And it's not just accessibility directly taken on as like, okay, now we fixed it. People are diverse and complicated, and so it has to exist throughout the lifespan. And that's one thing that Cam could probably say that far more articulated. But the idea that it's not just a one and done response, it's a holistic approach to understanding accessibility throughout the lifespan. So again, I think that maybe we move on, Olivia, because there's maybe like 4 or 5 more questions here.
Yeah, I think maybe during the break, Evan and I will work on responding to a couple people over message, and we'll start our break now. So it's 12:42. So if you could be back around 12:52, and we will have 2 more presentations from Cameron Crawford and from Peter Norman Levesque, and then as well as another question and answer period. So we look forward to seeing you again in about 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, it is 12:52. So if we can all start filtering back for Kim's presentation, that would be great. Okay, I think whenever you're ready, Cam.
Well, that's great. Thanks very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to present this, which was, I have to say, a really interesting piece of research and a privilege to be able to work on it. This is going to be a really non-technical presentation. So if, when you see the word statistical, your eyes glaze over, don't worry about it. It's not going to be like that. But there was a statistical component to this research project. And as Evan pointed out, the idea was to facilitate collaboration amongst participating universities to meet one of the SDG goals, to look at how to expand the reach of inclusive, supportive post-secondary education, which was another SDG goal, so that we could maximize the chances that people, upon graduating, would get not only any old job, but decent work, which was another SDG goal. And so really the question is, what's the relationship then between the quality of post-secondary education that students with disabilities obtain and the quality of work that they obtain? And just a bit of a background problematic here. There's tons of research on post-secondary education, and as Evan pointed out, there's tons of research on employment. Very little work on the quality of either. I mean, there's quite a bit on bits and pieces of problems that people have, but in terms of overall assessment of the quality of work and of the quality of post-secondary education, very, very little, and even less on the relationship between those two things. So to get to the bottom of this, we looked at two sources of data. One really major, the Canadian Survey on Disability, which Stats Canada has produced in one form or another since 1986, except for 1 year in there. And our own survey of students with disabilities, which kind of parallels the CSD, which is the Survey on Disability, but in a much simpler way. And I'll provide you a bit more detail as we go here. So I'm going to focus first on the post-secondary education piece and then on the employment piece and the relationship between the two, or how the research kind of conceptualized it. So we need to figure out, well, who are we talking about? And for various reasons that had to do with the number of people whose information we could obtain from the CSD, a decision was made to focus on young people who are between 18 and 34 years of age, who are either currently attending some form of post-secondary education, college, CEGEP, trade school, and so on, or they had, or they're at a university, or they had been at either of those in the last 5 years, because information is there on some people's fairly recent educational histories. So I thought it would be a good idea to mine that information. And so what are some selected issues in post-secondary education? Well, Evan kind of touched on some of this. And the kinds of information that we can obtain from the Survey on Disability are things like whether or not people need built environmental features to get into and around inside where they study, modified curriculum or procedures, human support, materials, technologies, and various individualized things that people may need, but that not everybody needs, or that a few people may need, but relatively small numbers. And then, as Evan also mentioned, are people looking at having to take on all kinds of additional costs or not? Are they feeling avoided at school or not? Are they feeling left out or bullied at school or not? And what about the equity of participation across fields of study? Like, are students with disabilities way more likely to be kind of congregating in certain fields of study and not having access to other fields of study like science and technology? Are they doing more art stuff, or like what's going on there? And are there kind of like educational ghettos that are organized along gender lines? or along ethno-racial lines. So those are some of the key kind of big high-level questions that informed the research. And what we were able to do is to devise a quality of post-secondary education index that basically puts together people's met needs or unmet needs for various things or other socioeconomic experiences in the domains that are shown here in the circle. So to what extent do people who need modified building features get what they require? Well, what about modified curriculum and procedures? Well, how about technology? To what extent are people taking on all kinds of additional costs? What about feeling left out and so on? And so for each of those domains, kind of an index was created. Some of these are based on many, many variables that are all equally weighted. So no one domain is worth a lot more than another in the index. And when you put it all together, conceptually it's pretty straightforward. Like if you need modified buildings and you get them, and if you need modified curriculum and you get it, and if you need modified technology and you receive it, and if you're not being bullied, which includes digital bullying and other forms of harassment, and if you're not feeling left out or excluded, like that sounds like a pretty good post-secondary system or experience, right? But if you're feeling needs that are not being met, or these negative social experiences, or you're going way into debt, that's not so great. So we were able to develop scores that range from very high to very low, and then divided those. That gets pretty technical. So then how do we kind of make that more intuitively meaningful? Well, let's carve it up into three kind of chunks. One, high quality, low quality, and somewhere in between. So it's kind of intuitively a bit easier to deal with. And then, okay, so we've got then this three-part division of high quality, medium quality, and low quality post-secondary education. Well, then what about, and then there's some other questions we want to ask, like to what extent are young people, first of all, just even getting into post-secondary education, and how does that look across various social and economic dimensions? Like, are people in Ontario way more likely to go to college than in Atlantic Canada, or less, or what's going on there? Well, what about college, like not university? What about people with learning disability? Way more or way less likely to go to school, and so on. And then going back to that three-part model I just showed you, well, what's the quality of post-secondary education that people are experiencing? Run by all of these dimensions I'm showing here on the PowerPoint that I won't read off for you. You can see that it involves a lot of scrutiny. And then the question is, well, to what extent then do people actually graduate? Like, it's one thing to get in, and it's one thing to have a good or maybe not so great experience of post-secondary education, but do people actually get through at the end of the day? And to what extent do people get through? And then the question is, well, what's the relationship between the quality of post-secondary education that young adults with disabilities experience and whether or not they graduate? So the research looks at all of those things by all kinds of these dimensions here. So it's not a quick read, but there's a lot of information in there that hopefully you'll find interesting. And just this is just an example of the kinds of things you can generate using this approach. Like look in the middle there, low income. You can see in the middle panel for college and CEGEP, young people with disabilities in low income families, low income households are way more likely than the average, which is 25%, to experience low quality post-secondary education. And way less likely, only 11.3% versus 25%, to experience high quality post-secondary education. So you can go through and scrutinize by all of these different dimensions, the quality of post-secondary education and the graduation and various other details for people. Okay, so that's one picture. And we can also look at the extent to which, like, if you think of someone who's, say, low income, well, they're either going to be male, female, or some other gender identity, and they may be white, but they may be BIPOC, they may be Indigenous, or they may be racialized, they may be from Atlantic Canada, or they may be from Ontario, and so forth and so on. So all of those different dimensions, the question is, well, so what matters? So with the education piece, we're able to run those as discrete pieces and look at the extent to which those pieces in isolation from one another contribute to people graduating, having a good versus not so good experience at the post-secondary education and so on. So that kind of discriminating analysis is available in the report. Going on to work, conceptually very similar. Like, first of all, the problem is that people with disabilities, as I'm sure you know, are way less likely than others to have jobs. Especially if they're living as unattached people, like single, or as lone parents, the rates of non-employment are very high. So it's not a great picture for people with disabilities on the employment front. And when you look at the research, again, there's tons and tons of research on employment. And you find when looking at the quality of it, well, there's research that says we have this discrimination and co-worker attitudes aren't great in a lot of cases. And sometimes the overall culture is not supportive of inclusion, and the pay isn't what it could be. And the work may be precarious, meaning people are on short-term contracts, and the hours may not be quite what they need. And people may need various job accommodations that they're not getting, and they may end up in a job ghetto, and there may be segregation on other bases. So the overall impression the research leaves you is that, well, in a lot of ways, the quality of work that people with disabilities get typically isn't great. But like, those are impressions. And if we take something like the International Labor Organization definition of decent work, they have worked out a definition that covers many dimensions of employment that include the social and economic context, which is sort of like the overall climate of the economy. But a thing like this survey on disability also has information on the extent to which people have access to training and professional development, the extent to which their earnings are either above or way below the earnings of others, whether or not people have the supports they need in order to be productive, whether people have the number of hours they need, or whether their hours are falling short, or maybe they're working too much, and whether or not their job is secure and stable, or whether it's precarious, whether or not they're being sort of congregated into employment ghettos. So there's various dimensions here that can be gotten at through the CSD. So what we did is we focused on the items that were doable with the CSD, which is a lot of what the International Labor Organization talks about in their definition of decent work. And kind of like what we did with education, put that together so that we've got this master index based on a number of sub-indexes for the items I just showed you, to derive a score ranging from very high to very low for the quality of work. So, for example, if you have access to employment, training, and other professional development opportunities, and you're earning at least as much or even maybe a bit more than what most other people earn, and you have the supports you need with the disability so you can work productively, and that job is pretty stable, it's not contract and it's not short term, and you're working in a kind of occupation where you're not being herded together with a lot of other people with disabilities, and your work environment is safe, it's not likely to produce disability or other illness and injury, and if you can move into a work environment because the employer is supportive of people doing so who have been ill or jobless for other reasons, and if you're also covered by some kind of collective agreement or union coverage, then that's a pretty good job. And a job where you have none of those is not a very good job. And then there's jobs in between. So again, like with education, we're able to kind of develop a model that lays out high quality, low quality, and various shades of gray in between. And also tax in then people who are jobless, because the information on employment is only available to people who are currently working or were recently working. And there's a whole huge group of people who are jobless for which employment-related information isn't as available. And again, like with post-secondary education, to what extent do people have good quality, crummy jobs, somewhere in between, and by all of these different dimensions that I talked about earlier? And what does having a job, say, of high quality have to do with graduating from college or university? Like, does either of those things make a difference? And if so, how, to what extent? And what about the quality of post-secondary education that people experience? Does that have anything to do with the quality of work that they obtain? So the methods then, as I kind of have alluded to, there's lots and lots of charts and tables and logistic regression tables that separate out the specific factors that are super accountable for why people have good jobs versus not very good jobs. And looking at the intersectional implications, like by ethno-racial diversity and gender and location in the country and so on. And because there's so much information there, focuses have been placed on where there are unusually high or unusually low patterns to help focus attention on where things seem to be quite good and maybe should be scaled up, and where things seem to be quite poor and really need to be addressed. So that's with the big survey on disability. And then the survey that we designed is similar in terms of its overall design, but way simpler. And I won't go through all of the different things that are included in it, but it's similar in terms of the overall structure. And basically it's to get a handle on the experiences of people at specific colleges and universities, whereas the CSD doesn't have that level of detail. Like, it gets people's individual experiences, but we have no idea what college or university they were at. And there are also some questions that we've asked that the CSD didn't ask, like, for example, whether people are or were recently involved with student organizations, disability organizations, mentors, whether they have been affected by COVID, and if so, how, and so on. And then in terms of the job, similar kinds of issues that were explored in the CSD are also explored in our own little survey, again, in a simpler way, but in a way that will allow for a building up of a kind of an index or a scale of good work versus not very good work, and somewhere in between. And again, we'll look at the relationships between good quality post-secondary and good quality work, and low quality post-secondary and low quality. So in a nutshell, that's the research. There's lots there. It was really fascinating and quite a challenge to pull together. And I'm really fortunate and happy to have an opportunity to work on this.
Thank you so much, Cam. That was fantastic. And again, if you have any questions for Cam, we will be doing another Q&A after Peter's presentation. So please put your questions there. And now I will turn it over to Peter for our final presentation for today.
Maybe just before that, Olivia, if it's okay, I think there was a question about whether this information is available on for the public. So Cam's report and Olivia and I's report is on our website. We have fact sheets as well, and executive summaries, and even blogs on our website. So if you're interested in learning more about the nuances of the research we talked about, please do visit the website. Okay, Peter.
Yeah, and that's linked at the end of the presentation as well. Perfect. Okay.
Thanks, Olivia. Thanks, Evan. I think we can come back to camera now, because I'm not using slides on this piece. I'm going to speak to innovation and to its link to knowledge mobilization. I love research, and one of the challenges of research is, how do we go from what we know to what we do and what gets done? And the overall goal of these conversations in many ways is to produce a call to action and to produce recommendations for innovations that actually lead to improvements and increased well-being of students with disabilities. One of the challenges with this concept of innovation often is that it becomes a buzzword. So people talk about innovation, and often they think about innovation in terms of the whistles and bells of technology, and that is part of innovation, but that's actually not the most exciting part of it. Innovation is really at this intersection between how well have we defined a problem and how well is the domain in which that problem understood. And so most innovation, and part of what we're going to be doing throughout these discussions and throughout this project, is identifying those places where innovation can happen, and if they can't happen, what needs to be done to get to that place. And so that's the lens that I'm helping Eviance bring to this, and I've worked with Eviance for a little more than a decade now to help them with these ideas around knowledge mobilization and innovation. And when I talk about knowledge mobilization, what I really mean in its simplest term is how do we take the very best of what we know from surveys, from research, from evidence assessment, such as the literature review, from the lived experience of people, both individually and collectively, even from traditional knowledge, and use that to create policies and programs and changes in perspective and things that lead to well-being. Knowing and doing, as we know, are not the same thing. And so we can know what to do, but unless we have incentives and infrastructure to move forward, then it's very, very difficult to move forward. And so most innovation is what's called sustaining innovation. And most of the innovation happens here because what it is that we're seeking how to get better at doing something we're already doing. And so an example of that can be very simple. We could say we want more accessible buildings, and we create a roadmap that leads to building codes and permitting and support systems to allow for greater accessibility. And some places do it better than others. I was recently in Japan, Sapporo in particular, and it's stunning how accessible the cities are and how their built infrastructure is. So sustaining innovation is one part. One of the parts that we think of as innovation often is this idea of breakthrough innovation. That's often, seen with technology, but it's not only technology. It can be that, but we have a well-defined problem that's just difficult to solve. And so in some ways, we need unconventional skills, ideas, perspectives, involvement, and hence intersectionality is really useful in helping with breakthrough innovation, because we get to see the problem from other perspectives and in fact include things that we may have missed beforehand. And so open innovation strategies, open discussions, dialogue can be really effective in helping to expose the problem to a diverse skill set. And I'll give you a very simple example that came in the conversations leading up to these sessions. Was we were talking about scholarships and economic supports and the challenges with having them. Well, what countries don't necessarily have those same challenges? What have they done that is different? For example, post-secondary education in the country of Germany, which is part of the G7, just like Canada, is free. And so you've eliminated the financial barrier. You still have a skill barrier, and there are other issues associated to that. You still have the competition that exists within institutions, but the financial barrier has been reduced. And so that's a breakthrough in that country that maybe we may be able to look at in a Canadian context or in other contexts, right? So the third type of innovation is this idea of disruptive innovation. And I listened into a number of conversations in a series of town halls led by Meads. And one of the things I heard was, we need to tear apart the system and rebuild it. That's a disruption. That's essentially, we're trying to think about the system that has currently been built is not working in a way that is optimal for us. And so we can't sustain that. That's not leading to where we want to go. And so what are the things that we can replace with a better way of doing things? How can things be removed? How could we actually rebuild things? This is actually an example where the problem is often the problem is well understood, or the problem is not well understood, but the system is understood, or the domain is really well understood. And one of the challenges with disruption is that there are externalities, there are other consequences that are associated to it. And so this becomes a really interesting conversation where those multiple skills, multiple perspectives that come in from an intersectional approach are really important. And then the final part of innovation is in part what we found here, which is research. Basic research is really about breaking pathways of innovation that are not quite fully formed yet. They're always about the discovery of a new phenomenon, or they're delving into something that we don't know very well. And that's actually part of what a survey produces. It's part of what doing a literature review does, is it identifies areas that we actually don't know very much. And so the innovation emerges from this continual searching for answers. And so this lends really of 4 types of innovation, and there's lots of literature around innovation. People have built entire schools around innovation, but this is the lens that we're using throughout the conversations. And as we move through, we're looking at that intersection between what do we know, as shown in the research, and what can we do, and what is the best approach to create the most amount of value and well-being for the people that are most affected by the work that we're doing here. So Evan, Olivia, I'll pass this back over to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Peter. That was great. So far we have one question in the Q&A, I think probably for Cam. It says, I work at PSE. We have access to survey data from our accessibility services office. What can those of us who do not work in accessibility offices do with that data, and where should we start with it? Oh, you're just on mute, Cam. Sorry, you're still on mute.
Okay, let's try that.
Perfect.
I'll look at my camera very politely so as not to disrupt the audio. I'm not totally clear what sort of survey data we're talking about. If we're talking about the survey on disability, then read the report. There's a lot in there that you can get out of it. It's got tons and tons of information in it. And the report actually in the tables and so on provide a lot of that. But what you could do that would be probably useful for where you are is if you have access to the raw data, is try to filter everything by province and maybe even rural, urban, or something like that to get some sort of handle on what things are like for people in a community like yours, like where you are. You won't be able to get that to the exact community, but large urban communities in a given province will tell you a lot. And then you could run some of the analysis that I've done by your own curiosities. But there are lots of very simple crosstabs you could perform using the CSD. So then you could take that and use that as the way of interrogating your own survey, if that's what you're talking about. Like, because I know that colleges and universities use their own surveys, and see what's in there that would be useful. But I guess key things that I think would be important to track would be who's getting in and who's not, first of all. And then looking at those who get in, who actually finishes. And for those who do finish, why is that the case? And for those who don't, why is that the case? And because there's a significant problematic to be understood there if students drop. And they may be having other difficulties that mean for a protracted period of study, which may not have to do with disability as much as it's not having enough money. And so they've got to hold 2 or 3 part-time jobs while studying, which takes a lot longer. And it would have taken a long time anyways if they had a disability in many cases. So yeah, who's getting through, and if not, why not? And what are the kinds of issues, unmet needs that people are experiencing that may help optimize the likelihood of getting through successfully?
Yeah, I think one thing to consider in this area too is that if we're looking at accessibility office data, we're probably missing quite a few people, and we're missing the people that for whatever reason could not access the accessibility offices, or were too intimidated by them, or maybe didn't have the medical documentation required for those accessibility offices. So that information is really helpful still, but definitely there's a lot missing in those kind of surveys as well.
But you actually pinpointed another problematic, like to what extent are the accessibility offices actually representative of the student body in terms of the experience of disability? And if it's not, then why is that the case? Like who's not coming forward, and why is that the case? And to understand that would lead, I think, ultimately to a much better service.
Absolutely. All right. If anyone has any more questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. But we are reaching the end of our webinar. I'm wondering, Evan, if you could just put up the last slide for the presentation. And if you have any questions that weren't answered in the Q&A, or you have further questions about things that were mentioned in the Q&A, please feel free to reach out to us via email. You can email me at olivia.boonstra@eviance.ca. You can email our executive director as well, Dr. Susan Hardy, or you can email Evan as well, or Cam if it's a specific question about the literature review or the data. Yeah, perfect. If you just want to put it on the thank you screen, that would be great. And I'm seeing 2 slides again. Yeah, so here includes the link to our emails, as well as our general website for Eviance and the project website, which is specifically on inclusive PSE. So if you're interested in learning more about this specific project, that's a great place to go. And this project is also continuing. It's not done, and we're in our final stage where we're looking at different ways that we can speak to experts and people with lived experience. So if that's something that interests you, again, I would encourage you to email us. You can email me, or again, I think probably Susan or Evan are probably the best people to get in touch with if you're looking to be more involved with the end of this project. I think we are all set. Oh, and there's also the presentations are available in the resource section. So if you want to download and view those, you can find those there, and then those will include all of the links for you as well. I will also say there is a quick poll at the end of the webinar when you leave. It's just a couple of questions, so if you could fill that out for us, very brief, that would be really great. And yeah, it should be coming up just now. All right, does anyone have any final thoughts before we go for the day? Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending today's webinar and for really engaging with us and for asking us questions. We really, really appreciate it. And again, if you're interested in this project, please reach out. We really look forward to maybe working with some of you in the future. So thank you so much, and please enjoy the rest of your day.